You're gripping the wheel like it's your last lifeline, Caleb. Relax, it's just me here. The voice of my stepfather, Victor, was smooth and steady, tinged with the faintest trace of amusement. His tone was always like this, unwaveringly calm, even when my heart felt like it was about to hammer out of my chest. I loosened my hold on the steering wheel and stole a quick glance at him. His dark hair was tousled from the wind, and the corner of his mouth quirked up in a lopsided grin that seemed to disarm my nerves and ignite something else entirely. This was supposed to be a normal driving lesson. Just another attempt for Victor to bond with me after marrying my mom 2 years ago. She had been insistent about this. Victor's so patient. He'll be perfect to teach you, she had said with a smile, oblivious to the silent storm of emotions that brewed whenever I was near him. The small sedan we were in hummed softly as it rolled down the deserted country road. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long golden streaks across the dashboard. The isolation of the road wasn't unusual for this part of town, but it added a weight to the air that made every word and movement feel amplified. Better, Victor said approvingly, his hand briefly brushing mine as he adjusted the gear. My skin tingled at the contact, and I quickly looked back at the road, hoping the color rising to my cheeks wasn't obvious. Victor had always been this way, charming without even trying, confident without being overbearing. He wasn't the type of man who demanded attention. He simply drew it naturally. His presence filled the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. It was no different now, sitting just inches away from me. "Good job, kid," he continued, his voice breaking into my thoughts. "I think you're getting the hang of this." I forced a smile. "Thanks. It's different when you're the one in control, you know?" "Exactly. Driving's about confidence," he said, leaning back in his seat. His shirt pulled taut against his chest, and I immediately cursed myself for noticing. "You've got to trust yourself behind the wheel. No second-guessing. Trust." That word lingered in the air longer than it should have, twisting into something far more complicated than the simple lesson he intended. I swallowed hard and tightened my grip on the wheel again, trying to focus on the stretch of asphalt ahead. The truth was I didn't trust myself, not around him. Victor had always been more than just a stepfather to me. From the moment he entered our lives, he carried an aura that commanded respect and admiration. At first, I thought it was innocent, a normal reaction to someone who seemed to have everything together. But over time, I began to realize that my admiration had grown roots in places I wasn't ready to admit, spreading into something deeper, something I couldn't control. The silence in the car was comfortable, yet charged. Every now and then, Victor would point out something about my driving. "You're hugging the line too much," or "Easy on the brakes, Caleb." Each correction came with a touch, a hand on my arm, a guiding nudge at the wheel. Every touch sent a jolt through me, subtle yet impossible to ignore. We reached a stop sign, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Victor leaned over slightly, his face closer than it needed to be as he pointed to the road ahead. "See that curve up there?" he asked. His voice was lower now, softer. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Take it slow," he instructed. "This road can be tricky if you're not paying attention." I glanced at him again, just for a second, and caught the way his eyes lingered on me, warm, but with something beneath the surface I couldn't quite name. It was enough to send my pulse racing, enough to make me question whether I was imagining things or if there was something unspoken hanging between us. The car eased forward as I turned onto the narrow curve, the sunlight flickering through the trees. The moment stretched out, heavy and almost surreal. For the first time, I felt like we were the only two people in the world, cocooned in this tiny, moving bubble of quiet intensity. Victor broke the silence first. "You're doing good, Caleb," he said, his voice almost too gentle. "You just need to trust yourself more. You've got it in you." His words struck a chord, not just about driving, but about something far more complicated. I managed a small smile, though my thoughts were anything but calm. The road ahead twisted and turned, much like the emotions I was wrestling with. And as the car rolled on, I couldn't help but wonder if this driving lesson was about more than just learning to steer. You keep overthinking it, Caleb. Just feel it out. Let the car respond to you, Victor said, his voice steady but with an edge of insistence. I eased the car forward, my grip on the wheel firm. The road ahead was narrow and flanked by tall pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Victor's words hung in the air, thick with double meaning. Or maybe it was just my imagination running wild again. Feeling it out wasn't as simple as he made it sound, and not just with the car. The unspoken weight between us had grown heavier since we started, filling every pause and glance. Victor leaned back in the passenger seat, his arm resting casually along the edge of the door. His fingers tapped lightly, almost in rhythm with the hum of the engine. "You got a natural feel for this, you know," he said, his tone softer now. "A little rough around the edges, but there's potential." I smiled faintly, unsure if his compliment was about driving or something else entirely. "Thanks. I guess I just need more practice." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that settled in the space between us. "That's what I'm here for." His words were simple, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It was the kind of reassurance that was too personal, too intimate for the situation. I kept my eyes on the road, but my focus was splintered, torn between the curve of the asphalt and the man sitting just inches away from me. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft rumble of the car and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Victor finally spoke again, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Let's pull over for a second," he said, nodding toward a gravel shoulder up ahead. "Give yourself a break." I obeyed, turning the wheel carefully and easing the car to a stop. The crunch of gravel under the tires was the only sound as I shifted into park. My hands lingered on the wheel for a moment before I let go, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Victor turned to face me, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Not bad," he said, nodding slightly. "You're starting to get the hang of it." "Thanks," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied me for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "You're too hard on yourself, Caleb. You got to learn to loosen up." His words struck a nerve. Loosen up? If only he knew how tightly wounded I was, how every second in this car with him felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Victor reached over, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The gesture was casual, but it sent a jolt through me, my breath catching in my throat. "You're tense," he said. "Relax your shoulders." I nodded stiffly, trying to follow his advice, but his hand stayed there, warm and grounding, and it was impossible to think clearly. "Better," he said, his voice dropping slightly. His hand lingered for a moment before he pulled it back, and I immediately missed the contact. He shifted in his seat, leaning slightly closer. "You're holding back, Caleb. Not just with driving. You've got this wall up, like you're afraid of making a mistake." I blinked, unsure how to respond. His words felt too precise, too accurate, as if he could see straight through me. "It's okay to trust yourself," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "To take risks." The air in the car grew heavier, the space between us shrinking despite neither of us moving. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. His words felt loaded, but I couldn't tell if it was intentional or if I was just projecting my own desires onto him. "I guess I'm just scared of messing up," I admitted finally, my voice barely audible. Victor's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Everyone is, but sometimes the only way to figure things out is to push past the fear." He leaned back again, giving me space, but the tension remained, thrumming just beneath the surface. "Ready to give it another go?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes still fixed on me. I nodded, gripping the wheel again, though my hands felt unsteady. As the car rolled forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just talking about driving anymore. Victor's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he looked out the window, his expression unreadable. The road ahead was winding, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted the lesson to end or if I was terrified of what might happen if it didn't. "Caleb, stop the car for a moment," Victor said, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated, glancing over at him. His gaze was steady, serious in a way that made my stomach twist. Without a word, I guided the car to the side of the road, the tires crunching against the gravel as we came to a stop. The silence in the car was deafening, save for the faint hum of the engine. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. Victor leaned forward, turning the key and silencing the engine. The quiet that followed was almost suffocating. "Caleb," he began, his voice softer now, "you've been tense this whole time. What's going on?" My pulse quickened, and I could feel the heat rising in my face. "Nothing," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Don't give me that," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I can see it. You're holding back like you're carrying something heavy. Talk to me." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. How could I explain the weight of what I was feeling? How could I admit the thoughts that had been swirling in my head since we started this lesson? Or, more accurately, since he became a part of my life. "It's nothing," I insisted, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor exhaled, leaning back in his seat. For a moment, I thought he would let it go, but then he did something I didn't expect. He reached out and placed a hand on mine, his touch warm and grounding. "You can trust me," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Something inside me broke at that moment. A dam I hadn't even realized I was holding back. My breath hitched, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. "It's just hard," I said, my voice trembling. "Being around you, feeling like this." Victor's expression didn't change, but his hand stayed where it was, steady and reassuring. "Feeling like what?" he asked gently. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. "Like I'm drawn to you," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "And I know it's wrong, but I can't stop." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching on like the road ahead. Finally, Victor sighed, his hand sliding away from mine. "Caleb," he said, his tone careful, measured. "This isn't something we can just ignore." "I know," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I know it's wrong, and I've been trying to push it away, but it's there. I can't help it." Victor's gaze softened, his eyes searching mine. "You're not the only one struggling with this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His words sent a jolt through me, a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You mean?" "I've noticed it too," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "And it's been eating at me, Caleb, because I care about you more than I should." Hearing him say it out loud felt like a weight lifting off my chest and pressing down at the same time. The acknowledgement of our shared feelings was both exhilarating and terrifying. "But it's complicated," Victor said, his voice tinged with regret. "It's not just about us. There's your mom, the family." "I know," I said quickly, the guilt already clawing at my chest. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't know what to do." Victor reached out again, his hand brushing against mine, but this time the gesture felt different, less grounding and more electric. "We need to be careful," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. "We can't let this get out of hand." The space between us seemed to shrink, the air thick with unspoken tension. For a moment, it felt like the world outside the car didn't exist, like it was just the two of us suspended in this impossible moment. Victor leaned closer, his hand now resting fully on mine. "Whatever this is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's something we need to figure out. Together." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The gravity of his words settled over me, mingling with the faint thrill of his touch. He pulled back slightly, breaking the spell. "Let's head home," he said, his voice steadier now. "We'll talk more when the time is right." As I restarted the car and guided it back onto the road, the silence between us felt different. Not empty, but filled with a quiet understanding. The tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but for the first time, it felt manageable. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road ahead. The journey wasn't over, but for now, it felt like we'd taken the first step toward understanding, whatever that might mean.